began thinking about a piece that Petra Coopers wrote about black women in the mid-19th century who had been experimented on by a man named Marion Sims, who in medical schools focused on gynecology is considered the father of gynecology in the West. He experimented on them to benefit white middle-class women who would use his services, his gynecology services. And what he did was really disgusting, very cruel. He would actually experiment on these women, of course without their consent, but when you're a slave, you're a property, so you don't actually have any say in what white people do to you. What Sims was trying to do was solve the problem of fistula amongst white middle-class women. And a fistula is a condition in which there's a tear in the bladder that happens during a long labor sometimes, or the improper use of forceps during labor tears the bladder. So women are constantly leaking urine. He did this without anesthesia. And one of the women that he did this on, he did more than 30 times. I mean, he cuts up their vaginas, their wombs, without anesthesia. Can you imagine that? It's really disgusting. But he's the father of gynecology. And we all know, most of us in the West, if you're a critical thinker when it comes to knowing the history of suffering and oppression, that the case of these black women is not singular. Experimenting on beings, human beings, non-human beings, it's been a reoccurring problem. And I also think during this time there was a huge push to end animal experimentation, vivisection. And if you don't know what that is, it basically is cutting up animals while they're alive for the benefit of medicine. And I know each person has their own unique opinion, which is invested in their interests and their desires. And of course, interests and desires are never apolitical. And one should really do a deep genealogy of why they desire certain things, even if it causes harm to other beings. One of my reasons for integrating black feminist theory and activism with studies around animal liberation and veganism is that I believe the same mentality that makes it okay to conduct cruel experiments on the black women in Dr. Sims' care, Dr. Sims, the gynecology, the father of gynecology, is the same mentality that continues to allow non-human animals to go through incredible hell. From factory farmed animals to animals used for testing cosmetics on their eyes to animals used for vivisection. And isn't it funny that those people who always say that, who always talk about how, well, this one being will have to be sacrificed for the greater cause of humanity, isn't it interesting that they're always in the power and position where they will never be that being or that person? And if you skip forward to today, you'll hear the same rationalizations for why hundreds of thousands of non-human animals are cut up and tortured for the betterment of humanity and medicine, when people of color were not seen as beings that could suffer. It was okay to actually have the same mentality, to say, it's okay. They don't feel, they don't have actual pain. And Dr. Sims actually said and believed, with a bunch of other people who created this concept of scientific racism, that people of African descent have a higher tolerance for pain and suffering than white people. So then when I talk to people about why I'm so interested in fusing Black feminist thought with understanding humans' relationships to non-human animals, to this concept of veganism, what we consume, I think the answer is clear. If you don't want someone to strap you down and cut you up, if you're disgusted by what was happening during antebellum period in America, where people like Dr. Sims strap these women down and cut up their vaginas repeatedly without any anesthesia, without any remorse. If you're disgusted by that, I just need to understand why you may not be disgusted by the same thing happening to non-human animals. And to put yourself in that place and really ask yourself, do I think that non-human animals really deserve to be treated this way because they're made for human use? And I just really need to understand. How is that one's right? And how is it that so many human beings can be disgusted at the thought of experimenting on a human being? Not even experimenting, just torturing somebody. Or putting them in slavery. I like to understand why there is this defense when so many people like myself, not necessarily parallel African slavery or the Nazi Germany and the Jewish Holocaust to non-human animal suffering today. So I'm not doing a parallel. I'm asking people to understand how this all fits into a huge matrix of oppression where all of these pieces are contingent upon each other and influence each other. You really need to understand that colonialism and racism have been built upon this understanding by those that were ruling, and to some degree even the elite of today, that those who are truly and fully human are white, property-owning males who can think rationally. And then there's the other that can actually be colonized and dominated. The other being women, non-white people, people without property or owning land. And that these others conveniently fit into the elite's conception of capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism. So when you start talking about people of color, and you start talking about the mistreatment of animals within the context of how the other has been constructed, within the perception of the white male, formally educated, class privileged property owner, you begin to see how othering, distancing, cutting off your capacity to empathize and sympathize is incredibly important when you want to create a world based on imperialism and capitalism. You want to objectify You want to colonize and you want to dominate the other as resources, as commodities, so you can continue to benefit in that particular position of power. And it isn't just that particular white racial status quo, that's just an example. And I'm always perplexed, always, when I encounter non-white minorities who are very, very against institutionalized racism, have the visceral experience of being othered, of not having their pain and suffering taken seriously. I'm always very, very perplexed when these come up, the doors come up, the walls come up. When I ask them to think about, well, how do you think non-human animals feel as well? About being othered, about their pain and suffering not being taken seriously.